Please open your Bibles, if you would, to the book of Matthew, chapter 24. We're going to jump into Matthew 24 pretty quickly and move pretty quickly throughout our lesson this evening. A lot of area to cover within this lesson, so hopefully it will be not only understandable but profitable for you as we go through this passage. Good to see everyone. Do you have some visitors? We're glad that you're here. Hope that what we have to say, what we examine this evening might be helpful to you in your service to the Lord. Now, I've been, as long as I can remember, hearing about wars and rumors of wars, that this is the sign that the coming of the Lord is almost here. And this is derived from Matthew chapter 24. We're going to read verses 4 through 8. Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilence, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Now, we're going to point out many things throughout the lesson. I think one of the most obvious thing is that within the verse it says, this is not the sign. Wars and rumors of wars is not the sign, no matter what he's talking about. But nonetheless, since I can remember, I've heard people say wars and rumors of wars. Look at what's happening in the earth. Look at all the famines, the pestilence, earthquakes. This is the sign. The coming of the Lord is imminent. It's almost here. Let me read to you from a book, John Price. He wrote the book, The Coming of Christ. And in the book, this is his premise in the book. The burden of the book is this, that Christ will return to this earth, restore Israel to Palestine and save them, and will establish again the throne of David, and from that throne rule over the entire earth. This is the kingdom that will be a literal kingdom of a visible Christ reigning over a literal people, that eventually heaven will be on this earth. John Rice is a premillennialist. That is, he believes that there is going to be a 1,000-year literal reign of Jesus on a literal throne, being centered in Jerusalem and ruling over Jerusalem and the world as the Jewish nation is restored once again. In his book, and again, when did he write this? John Price. Wars and rumors of wars. Just before Jesus comes, we would expect the world to be filled with wars and rumors of wars, and that time is evidently upon us. The nations are armed to the teeth. The world war came just when many thought that it was impossible. Many honest souls went into that believing that it was a war to end war. But the world is infinitely more warlike today than ever before. China is being confiscated by Japan. Italy has raped and seized Ethiopia. The situation grows tense between Russia and Japan, between England and Italy. Political signs of the coming of Christ is the restoration of the Roman Empire under Mussolini. The Italian-Ethiopian War has made Italy practically the master of the Mediterranean Sea, and her king has now become an emperor, and Mussolini is hailed as the founder of an empire. The restoration of the Roman Empire has already begun, and this is a convincing fact that the coming of Christ is very near. You have an idea of when this was written yet? I go on. Famines, pestilence, earthquakes. In China and in India in recent years, famines have killed millions of people. At this very hour in China, millions are at the point of starvation. In Russia, the reign of communism has been a reign of terror and of famine, and want is everywhere in the land. The present worldwide depression is simply another name for the famines prophesied in the Bible. Likewise, pestilence is mentioned by the Savior as a sign of His coming. Remember the flu epidemic of 1918? This was just the beginning of a modern scourge. Remember the increasing prevalence of cancer, the increase of deaths by heart failure, the disease by diabetes, etc. Surely this is a sign, We are nearing the end, and great earthquakes have killed thousands in Yokohama, Japan, in San Francisco, and in Long Beach more recently. These are but links to the chain that proves that Jesus is coming soon. That was 1936. Hal Lindsey, in Countdown to Armageddon, wrote in the 1980s, wars. No period has witnessed the escalation of weapons and stakes of war as in the 20th century. The Cold War between the U.S. and Russia broke out over the Soviet blockade of Berlin. 2 years later, the Korean War began to rage. Israel returned to war in 1956, 67, and 73. America's only deadly battle in Vietnam lingered on for 8 years. And as this book is written, the Russians have again showed the seriousness of their plan to dominate the world by invading Afghanistan. That was in the 1980s. You remember what happened before America invaded Iraq, when Saddam Hussein was then the ruler? I remember hearing from a pulpit, a denominational church here in Huntsville, that Saddam Hussein is the Antichrist. And all of these wars and rumors of wars is a sign that the end is near. Well, he's dead. And then when 9/11 happened, I remember hearing that Osama bin Laden is the Antichrist. And with all the wars and rumors of wars, that the end must be near. And I would imagine you will hear in not a very long period of time that with all that's happening in our world, we have ISIS shooting down a Russian airliner. We have in Paris this terrorist attack. We have all of these wars and rumors of wars. There is famine, there is pestilence, there are earthquakes. This is the sign that Jesus Christ is imminent in His return. Again, this is part of the premillennial doctrine that doesn't show up very well. In the premillennial idea, this is from Tim LaHaye's book. He believes that Matthew 24 is talking about what is going to happen, that you have the church age now, then you have the destruction of Jerusalem that happens, Jesus talks about in the first few verses of chapter 24, but then he talks about the tribulation years, and the sign that the tribulation years is upon us is wars and rumors of wars, and that's going to escalate into the millennial reign, the 1,000-year literal reign of Jesus Christ on the earth. Over and over and over and over again, we are being told by the denominational world, by premillennialists, that wars and rumors of wars, that is the sign. Now, in reality, the biblical teaching is, and it's not forwarding for me. Michael, would you hit that for me, please? The biblical teaching is, this is for suspense, is that Jesus Christ died, He was resurrected, and He went back to heaven to sit on His throne. Right now, Jesus is reigning over a spiritual kingdom. And this is the greatest kingdom that has ever been established or will ever be established in the history of the world. We are part of it in the church. There is no literal reign of Jesus on the earth for 1,000 years. That at the end of time, we are all going to be caught up after the resurrection with Jesus. We're going to meet Him, and then there's going to be this great dissemination between heaven and hell. Premillennialism on many fronts, in many areas, is not accurate with the Bible. In fact, it distorts the biblical teaching. But let's go through Matthew chapter 24. And actually, the destruction of Jerusalem is an event that took place that was described in Matthew 24 and has already been passed. I believe all of that has already been fulfilled. But let's look at Matthew 24. Because Jesus is talking here about the destruction of Jerusalem. Actually, let's look at chapter 23. Let's begin there. When Jesus in verse 1, chapter 23 and verse 1, spoke to the multitudes and his disciples. He's there in Jerusalem, and he's talking to the multitudes just a couple of days before his death. And he tells the people, don't follow the scribes and the Pharisees because they're a bunch of hypocrites. They have an outward righteousness, but they have nothing on the inside. In fact, in chapter 23 and verse 13, he turns and zeroes in on those scribes and Pharisees. And he says, woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. In fact, 8 times he pronounces woes upon the scribes and the Pharisees and the hypocrites. He's talking to the people there in the first century because of their righteousness was not right in the sight of God. Notice how he, verse 34, is going to summarize this. He says, therefore, indeed I send you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city. That on you. He's talking to the scribes and the Pharisees and the hypocrites, how they have denied the Lord, how they have persecuted those who follow Jesus, and how they were going to continue to do that. He says that, excuse me, again, verse 35, that on you may come all of the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Assuredly, here's Jesus' promise, assuredly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Jesus is talking to the Jews in the first century, specifically to the scribes and the Pharisees and the hypocrites, and he says, on you is going to come the blood of all of these righteous ones. It will come upon you in this generation. Talking about the first century Jews, that Jewish nation, that Jewish generation. Now, he didn't want it to be like that. He cries out, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who sent her. How often I wanted to gather your chickens together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. He had compassion on them, but he pronounces 8 woes upon them. And he says, these woes are going to come upon this generation. Chapter 24 and verse 1. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. So notice the scene has changed. He's not talking to the multitudes and the scribes and the Pharisees that he's pronounced these woes upon. Now his disciples, he's going to have a conversation with them. But he tells them quite clearly in verse 2, do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, that not one stone shall be left here upon another that will not be thrown down. Jesus is talking about the same thing. He's talking upon that generation. This destruction is going to come. In fact, it is going to be so severe that it is not as if someone is going to come, move you away from your nation, and is going to inhabit it again, or inhabit it for a while, and then you're going to come back. He doesn't say that. He says it is going to be so severe, this destruction, that they're going to topple this temple so that not one stone is left upon another. Going to be totally destroyed. What happened in 70 AD? This is a model of the temple. It has to be a model because we can't see it anymore because it doesn't exist anymore. It's been destroyed. In fact, archaeologists have dug down by the wall that surrounded the whole temple complex that was built by Herod the Great in the time of Christ. And they have found rocks that were from the top, from the buildings that surrounded of the temple and that surrounded the temple that were on top of the Temple Mound. They found those rocks that are still there today that have been unearthed. They were buried for hundreds of years, but they have been unearthed as evidence that, in fact, the Romans came and they were so angry with the Jews because of their contentious rebellion against them that they just pushed off the stones. They just totally wiped out the temple altogether. That happened 70 AD. History tells us that and testifies of that. In fact, you could go to Jerusalem today, and you could go to the same area today, and you will not find the temple. The temple has not been built on that site for almost 2,000 years. Almost 2,000 years. And what's on that site right now is the Islamic Dome of the Rock. And there's going to be a war if the Jews ever tried to build on that spot again. From 70 A.D., it was destroyed. The rocks were even pushed off of the walls of the Temple Mount, and it has never been destroyed. Notice that Jesus says in chapter 23 and verse 36, "Assuredly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." He goes through chapter 24, and let's read chapter 24 and verse 34. Jesus says, "Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things are fulfilled." So you have bookends. At the beginning of these woes, there's going to be destruction on this generation. At the end of a description of this, he says, on this generation, all these things are going to be fulfilled. Now, I recognize in my Bible, it has, the translators have put over parts of my Bible, the second coming. Maybe you have that in yours as well, the second coming. Why do they have the second coming over a set of verses that Jesus says is going to be fulfilled in that generation? It's only because of twisted false teaching, not because of biblical exegesis, not because of that's what the text says. Jesus is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in these verses. So let's go through the verses and see what he says. We've already noted in chapter 24 and verse 2 that Jesus says that it's going to be so devastating, the destruction, that one stone will not be upon another stone. Verse 3, he sat on the Mount of Olives, and his disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So they want more information. Jesus said it's going to come upon this generation, but they want to know when. When is this going to come? And really, I think they're asking basically the same question. When is this going to happen? When are you going to come in destruction? When is the end of this age? Perhaps they thought that when this happened was going to be the end of the world. I don't know. Perhaps they understood that it was going to be the end of the Jewish age. But nonetheless, they're looking for more information. When is this going to happen? So, verse 4, Jesus says, "Make sure no one deceives you." There have been a lot of deceivers, not just in the first century, but in the 20th century and in the 21st century as well, who twist these verses. He says, "Don't let anybody deceive you." Verse 5, "For many will come in my name and say, 'I am the Christ,' and deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." Notice that this is not the sign of his coming, even of the destruction of Jerusalem. There's always been wars and rumors of wars. And in the first century, there were wars and rumors of wars. It's not the end, Jesus says. If you ever have anyone say to you, wars and rumors of wars, the end is imminent, look at the verse. Jesus says, that's not my sign. That's not when it's going to happen. "For nation," verse 7, "will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines, pestilence, earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and be hated of all nations for my sake. Many will be offended and betray one another and be hated one of another. Then many false prophets will rise and deceive many, because the lawlessness will abound and the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end will be saved." I mean, did that happen in the first century? Was there persecution in the first century? Well, we know that Stephen was killed, and we know that there was a persecution against the church that began there in Jerusalem, and that it spread throughout. In fact, we have letters, for example, that Peter writes talking about this persecution that's going to come on the church. Yes, there was persecution within the first century, just as Jesus had predicted. He says you need to endure to be saved. Verse 14, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached to all the world as his witness to the nations, then the end will come. I've heard this as well. People saying, oh, look at all of the evangelistic efforts that are taking place in our day and time. This is a sign that the end is imminent, that is almost here. If you would keep your finger here in Matthew 24, we'll come right back, but go over to the book of Colossians, chapter 1. In the book of Colossians chapter 1, we find that Paul, about 62 or so AD, so about 30 years after Jesus said this, 30 years after he said that all the world is going to hear the gospel, Paul writes from his prison cell in Rome, Colossians chapter 1 and verse 23, if indeed you continue in the faith grounded and steadfast, and not moved away from the hope of the gospel, which you heard, which was preached to every creature under heaven, of which I, Paul, became a minister. As a matter of fact, the gospel has already been preached to the whole world. In fact, the gospel was preached to the whole world in the first century, about 30 years after the gospel first began to be preached. And Paul, an inspired writer, identifies that for us. Let's go back to Matthew chapter 24. So all of that has happened. The wars, rumors of wars has happened. The persecution has already happened. The gospel being preached to the whole world, all of that's already happened. It's not something that's going to take place in the future. In verse 14 says, then the end will come. Now he gives us the sign, verse 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads it, let him understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Here is the sign, he says, and when you see this sign, you need to run. Now, when all this other stuff, wars, rumors of wars, and the persecution has happened, that's happening, that's leading toward it, but when you see the abomination of desolation, he says, you need to run. You need to get out of Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. Now, look at Luke chapter 21, because this is a parallel passage. It describes the same thing and perhaps gives us another idea of what this means, this abomination of desolation. He says in chapter 21 of Luke, and in verse 20, he says, and when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then let those in Judea flee to the mountains, let those who are in the midst of her depart, and so forth. So this abomination of desolation is going to take place when the armies are going to surround Jerusalem. And specifically, I believe he has reference to when the temple itself is defiled by Gentiles. Now, if you would, go back to the book of Daniel, because that's what Jesus references here, the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Daniel chapter 9. Now, we're not going to go into a huge amount of detail here, because there's a huge amount of detail here. But we're just going to kind of do an overview here of In Daniel chapter 9, we're going to start reading in verse 25, where Daniel is looking forward into his future and seeing 70 weeks take place. And he describes it. Verse 25, know therefore and understand that from the going forth to the command to restore and build Jerusalem. So Daniel sees that Jerusalem is going to be restored. That took place in 536. Until the Messiah, the Prince, that's Jesus Christ, who came, born 4 BC, died 33 AD. There shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall in troublesome times. And after the 62 weeks, the Messiah shall be cut off. The Messiah is going to die, but not for himself. And the people of the prince who shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end of it shall be with a flood. And till the end of the war, desolations are determined. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. That's the covenant that we have of Christ. But in the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, and to the wing of abominations shall be one who is desolate, even unto the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. So Daniel is looking forward into world history, and again, we won't go into detail of all of this, but he's looking at the 70 weeks, looking at the restoration, once again, of Jerusalem that took place under Nehemiah, and they rebuilt Jerusalem, and then the Messiah comes, and then he says is going to be the abomination of desolation. He talks about that coming here that Jesus is talking about in Matthew 24. And that took place when Jerusalem was destroyed. When the Gentiles went into the Temple Mount and went into the sacred area, the Gentiles were not allowed to be within the walls of the temple, within the holy place, within the most holy place. But Gentiles did go in there. And the Gentiles did knock down those walls and throw those stones over the wall. That was an abomination of desolation. That was a desecration of the holy place. Let's go back to Matthew chapter 24. Jesus says that's the sign. There's going to be a lot of rumors. There's going to be a lot of things said. But when you see that, he gives them some specific warning, some specific direction for them to do. Back in Matthew chapter 24 and in verse 15, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not come down for anything out of his house. Let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter or in the Sabbath. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as not been since the beginning of the world unto this time. No, not ever shall be. Now, when you see this abomination of desolation, when you see the Gentiles, when the Romans enter into the temple, Jesus says, run. Run. You've got no more time. Run. Run to the mountains. And it's a good thing if it's not on the Sabbath. Why? Because the gates are going to be closed on the Sabbath. It's going to make it harder to run. Hope or pray that it's not in wintertime. Why? Because it's cold in the wintertime and it's hard to run. And pray that you're not pregnant during that time. Why? Because it's hard to run when you're pregnant. Jesus says you need to run. Now, think about it. If premillennialism is right, and this is talking about the coming of the Lord, what difference does it make if it's on the Sabbath or in the winter? Why are you supposed to run from Judea if Jesus is coming back? The vast majority of us aren't going to be in Judea. We're not going to be anywhere around there. This has no application. If this is referring to the second coming of the Lord, what would it matter? Why does he say, don't go back and get your cloak? What difference would that make at the second coming of the Lord? All of the earth is going to be destroyed at that time. Well, not according to premillennialism, but if it is, in fact, the destruction of Jerusalem, it makes perfect sense. Jesus is saying you need to run. Don't let anything hinder you, because if you let something hinder you, it's going to get bad. In fact, he says there in verse 21, it's going to be a great tribulation, such has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. Now, there have been some terrible, horrible tribulations that have taken place on this earth. I can't attest to which is the worst. But Jesus says, this is bad. This is the greatest tribulation. Why? Remember what he said, woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. On you, all of the righteous blood is going to come upon this generation. God is going to judge that people. They are going to suffer because of that. And it's going to be so bad, it's never been as bad and will never be as bad again. We don't have any videotape of what it was like in Jerusalem at that time. But during this destruction, Josephus, not a Christian, but an observer, an objective observer, says that there were 97,000 that were taken away as slaves and 1,100,000 who died. Now, in a footnote, he says 1,337,490. I don't know which one is more accurate. But you have a city that, I don't know what its normal population was, but about 100,000, I would say, at the most, 100,000, this city. But in this city, 1.1 million people are going to die. That's just hard to imagine. And we're not talking about, you got Hiroshima and Nagasaki. If you put both of those together, that's 106,000 people died horribly, very quickly, in an atomic bomb. That's 1/10 the size. But there was no atomic bomb that destroyed the people in Jerusalem. This is hand-to-hand combat with swords and with knives and with clubs. 1.1 million people died in the destruction of Jerusalem. I can only take the word of Jesus, and that is, it's never been that bad, and never will be that bad again. Verse 22, and unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days were shortened. Now, it's difficult to understand what he's talking about here, but historically, they say, that the Romans went in and laid siege against Jerusalem, and for some reason, they pulled back before the final destruction, and then they went in with a vengeance, and they destroyed it all, and they massacred all of those people. And some historians, I think it's Eusebius says, that not a single Christian died in the destruction of Jerusalem. I don't know if that's true. I would say that not a single Christian who listened to the prophecy of Jesus Christ died, because Jesus Christ told them exactly when they needed to run. Verse 23, and if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe, for false Christ or false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders, so as to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I told you beforehand. Therefore, if they say to you, look, he is in the desert, do not go out. Look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. I'm sure that there were false prophets during that time who were nationalists of the Jews, saying the Romans cannot destroy us, follow me. Jesus says, don't follow me, because I said they're going to be destroyed. Verse 27, for as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. For wherever the carcass is, the eagles will gather together. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all of the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds and from one end of heaven to the other. Now, many times when we read verses like this, we think of the second coming, the coming of the Lord, because there are verses that describe the coming of the Lord with this type of apocalyptic type language. But keep in mind that in the context of the Bible, actually many times this kind of language is used in the destruction of many nations. Just as an example, go with me to the Old Testament, if you would, to the book of Isaiah. We'll just look at a few examples of this, where this apocalyptic, this Jesus or this God coming in the clouds, of the moon being darkened and the sun not giving off its light, it is used many times of God coming into judgment against a nation. Here in chapter 13 of Isaiah, it is a prophecy of the destruction of of Babylon, verse 1, burden against Babylon, which Isaiah, son of Amos, saw. We'll pick up the reading here in verse 6. This is Isaiah 13 and verse 6. Wail, for the day of the Lord is at hand. Now, the day of the Lord is destruction of Babylon, not the second coming in this context. The day of the Lord is at hand. It will come as destruction from the Almighty. Therefore all hands will be limp, every man's heart will melt, and they will be afraid. Pangs and sorrows will take hold of them, and they shall be in pain as a woman in childbirth. They shall be amazed to one another. Their faces shall be like flames. Behold, if the day of the Lord comes, cruel with both wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate. He will destroy its sinners from it. From the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forth. The moon will not cause its light to shine. It's figurative language here, talking about the great destruction of God coming upon this nation, and all of the kings, all of its counselors, all of them are going to be darkened by the power of God. Chapter 19 and verse 1, the burden against Egypt. Behold, the Lord rides on a swift cloud and will come into Egypt. The idols of Egypt will totter at his presence, and the heart of Egypt will melt in its midst. In the book of Micah, we'll jump out of the Isaiah into one of the minor prophets to give one example. In the book of Micah, the very first chapter here, in chapter 1 and verse 3, he's talking here to Samaria, to Israel. Hear, all you peoples, listen, O earth, and all that is in it. Let the Lord God be a witness against you, and the Lord from his holy temple. For behold, the Lord is coming out of his place. He will come down and tread the high places of the earth. The mountains will melt under him. The valleys will split like wax before the fire. Like water is poured out a steep place. So many times in the Old Testament, we have God coming into judgment against a nation, and it is pictured as God coming in the clouds, God coming in fierce anger, and the sun not able to give its light, and the moon, so forth. Back to Matthew chapter 24, Jesus uses this language to talk about the destruction of Jerusalem. It's all in the same context. He's not talking about the second coming. There are other passages, other contexts where it talks about him coming, but not this context. He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, and he's making it personal. There is going to be a destruction. Not one stone is going to be left upon another. And I want you to know who the source of that destruction is. Jesus says it's going to be me. I'm coming on a cloud, and nothing's going to stop me. All the world is going to see that I have destroyed Jerusalem, is the point of Jesus. We continue in verse 32. Now learn the parable from the fig tree, and its branch has already come tender and puts forth its leaves. You know that summer is near. You see also, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, very near the doors. Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away until all these things are fulfilled. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. Jesus is making a prediction of the destruction of Jerusalem, not the second coming. And he says in this generation. Now, the premillennialists have to redefine what generation means. Typically, it means about 40 years. Jesus said it about 33 AD. Destruction of Jerusalem took place 70 AD. That's 37 years. That's a generation. Within that generation, people who heard those words were going to see this destruction. Premillennialists have to redefine generation unto age, or as Hal Lindsey said it, it began when Jerusalem was in 1948, when it started to be a kingdom again, or a nation again, and it was going to come within a generation, although that's been over 40 years now. But nonetheless, Jesus is very clear. It was all going to take place in this generation. So let me sum it up this way. What was going to happen, Jesus is talking about, is the termination of the Jewish system. When Jesus Christ died on the cross, the Old Testament law was nailed to the cross. So that legally speaking, there was a transition, there was a change of the law. The covenant of Moses was now filled full, and now the covenant of Jesus, because of His blood, was being established. And Jesus' covenant is still in establishment. It seems to be that the destruction of Jerusalem is the practical end of the Jewish system. It's interesting that in the middle of that, the Hebrew writer says, before the destruction, he wrote before 70 AD, that what we see that is vanishing away is obsolete and nigh unto vanishing away. He saw that practically it was over, but when Jerusalem was destroyed, there can be no Jewish system, because the temple was the center of the Jewish system. That's where they offered their sacrifices. That's where they kept their genealogical records. That's where all of the rulers stayed. When the destruction of Jerusalem happened, the rulers were killed. The genealogical records were destroyed. And the temple was destroyed. Since that time, there has never been a place for the Jewish nation to offer their sacrifices. Why? Because it's over. And now we have the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Now we have the new covenant that has come. If you're not a Christian in the audience, we'd encourage you to come unto Jesus. Don't go to Moses, because that's over. Come to Jesus. That's where salvation is. And I would encourage all of us to be diligent in our study. And when those of the denominational world approach us, open our Bibles and show the context of what's happening so that we make sure that we believe and follow the truth. If you are not a Christian, we encourage you to become one. If you are a Christian and for some reason have gone back into the world, we would encourage you to come back to the Lord tonight while we stand and sing.